Ahoy there, mateys. It's old Doc Mulder with another installment of A Taste of Critical Thinking. Episode 6, I think we're up to. We're going to talk about the structure of an argument, meaning of the word argument. In the last episode, we talked about this central critical thinking task of supporting a belief or a claim you make, and we worked through some of the potential ambiguity there to focus on critical thinking is primarily concerned with supporting a claim with relevant evidence that is indicative of the truth of your claim. And the way that evidence is presented is typically in what we call an argument. But right off the bat here, another potential ambiguity, the word argument unfortunately brings to mind, I would venture to say for most people, argument as fighting. Kind of competitive or combative, antagonistic approach to argument where there's a winner and a loser. That's not great for critical thinking because people tend to focus exclusively on winning when critical thinking is really focused entirely on finding the best answer to a question. So critical thinking uses argument, what I like to call argument as reasoning. And we should try to avoid argument as fighting. It's generally just counterproductive. Argument as reasoning is, when it's done properly, is a win-win for everybody involved. Argument as fighting is in this dynamic of win-lose. So argument as reasoning is a win-win, and our society tends to love win-win situations, except in this particular case, people seem to gravitate toward the more combative, contentious, argumentative approach. And I think this, has a profound effect. But I think this connotation of argument as fighting, antagonistic, has a deep impression in people's psyche. And maybe even more so in American culture than in some other cultures. It dominates our conception of what argument is or what argument can be. Incidentally, I highly recommend a classic little sketch from Monty Python called The Argument Clinic. You can find it on YouTube where they play with these two different conceptions of argument. But I think they're so radically different, they shouldn't go by the same name. So it's tricky. Argument as reasoning doesn't even entail there's another person involved. You can just privately go through what are my arguments for believing such and such. So we want to steer clear of argument as fighting. And argument as reasoning must be distinguished from mere rhetorical one-upsmanship or rhetorical flourish or rhetorical tricks to win over an audience. Argument as reasoning sometimes doesn't get through to an audience as well as some other rhetorical tricks, but argument as reasoning is focused on, like I say, finding the best possible answer to a question or the best solution we can find to a problem. Citing relevant evidence is presented in an argument. An argument has to be a series of statements, a series of questions, for example, can't really count as an argument. Somebody giving a command, that doesn't count as an argument. An argument is a series of statements or assertions, and some of the statements cite the alleged evidence in support of another statement that we call the conclusion, the claim that you're trying to support. So premises present the evidence, conclusion is the claim you're trying to support. You're trying to make a convincing case that the conclusion is in fact true. Arguments are meant to express the reasoning process, the thought process in the mind comes first, and we call that inference. So I look at my phone and it says today is Tuesday. I will mentally infer tomorrow is Wednesday. It just follows by definition. But if I articulate it in a series of propositions, then I've made an argument. Another important term here, the thinking process, reasoning, is called inference. Another important term is implication. That's the relationship we hope to have between our premises and our conclusion. We hope that the evidence cited implies our conclusion to a sufficient degree. So if I claim today is Tuesday, that logically implies tomorrow is Wednesday. So this argument as reasoning, logical argument, sometimes it's called, is argument as fighting is evaluated, who won, who lost. Argument as reasoning is evaluated as logically correct or logically incorrect. And that's one of the primary skills to build in critical thinking, is to correctly distinguish correct arguments from incorrect arguments. Identifying arguments here, it's important to notice an argument is not a conditional or hypothetical claim. I could say, if today is Tuesday, then tomorrow is Wednesday. But I haven't made the argument that tomorrow is Wednesday because I haven't actually asserted today is Tuesday. I just said if. So it's purely hypothetical, as we say, or conditional. To make the argument, you need to actually assert the premises, today is Tuesday, and then from that assert the conclusion, tomorrow is Wednesday. An argument, another important distinction, argument versus explanation, and this gets tricky largely because of ordinary language uses a lot of the same key terminology that leads to confusion. On the surface, it seems easy enough. When you give an argument, a logical argument, you're trying to cite evidence to convince your audience that your conclusion is true. When you offer an explanation, typically you're offering reasons or causes for a claim that you assume your audience already knows is true. So you might explain why the train derailed. You're not trying to convince anybody the train derailed. It's pretty obvious. But explanation looks for causes, usually. It's finding causes for something we already know to be true. However, argument is trying to convince somebody of your conclusion. So I might tell my fellow chemistry student, we don't have a quiz next week in chemistry, and they say, well, how do you know? That's a common phrase we have for asking somebody for their evidence. And I'd say, well, the syllabus said there's a quiz in chem every 2 weeks, and we had one this week. Therefore, conclusion, we don't have chem quiz next week. And so I'm trying to convince them that the conclusion is true, whereas explaining the train wreck, I'm not trying to convince anybody the train crashed. It's very obvious. Another point about explanation is it shouldn't be confused with justification. You could explain someone's behavior without justifying it or excusing it, for example. Justifying someone's behavior requires argument, reasoning. But explanation, you could just cite causes like, well, they were very stressed out. That's why they reacted that way. Anyway, ordinary language can be quite confusing, even to the extent that sometimes people will use the word explain when they mean argument. Somebody might say, well, let me explain why we should abolish the death penalty. And then they give an argument, of course, trying to convince you that we should abolish the death penalty. So our language seems designed maybe by an evil genius conspiring to confuse us on this issue. So it does take some work. It does take a lot of practice. You have to build your skills at looking for the sorts of claims that need this kind of evidential support. So that's a little introduction to the nature of argument, presenting evidence in support of a claim, supporting the truthfulness of a claim. That's central to critical thinking. So I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoy my videos, please like and share. And I wish you to be well and think well and navigate the confusing complexities of life successfully.